Dear ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome to the US-Ukraine Business Council's webinar. I'm Irina Paliashvili, Chair of the US-Ukraine Business Council's Legal Committee, and I'm very pleased to welcome and introduce our exclusive guest today, prominent international economist Timothy Ash. Timothy is a senior sovereign strategist at RBC Bluebay Asset Management in London, and also an associate on the Russian and Eurasian program at Chatham House. Tim has covered Ukraine as an analyst for more than 35 years. Unusually, he covers the interaction of geopolitical and markets and has been a long-time investor in Ukraine for over 25 years. He writes extensively on Ukraine. Many of you are subscribers to his daily update and sometimes hourly updates, and he published over 350 opinion pieces in the Kyiv Post, Kyiv Independent, Financial Times, and many other prominent publications. He's known for his independence of thought, trying to tell us as it is, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Thank you for joining us, Tim.
My pleasure.
This webinar was supposed to be moderated by USUBC President Morgan Williams. But as the USUBC community knows, the very sad news that Morgan passed away on June 8th. It is a huge loss for our community, and I would like to read the USUBC statement. It is with great sadness and profound sorrow that we announce the passing of Morgan Williams, President and CEO of the US-Ukraine Business Council. The family shared with USUBC that Morgan passed away peacefully in his home in California on June 8th, next to his wife Linda. Morgan was a loving husband, father, grandfather, and great-grandfather. He will be remembered as a brilliant individual, the truest American patriot, a proud son of the state of Kansas, and the devoted servant of his adopted country of Ukraine. For the international business community and everybody at the US-Ukraine Business Council, Morgan was a living legend, a remarkable visionary leader who was always at the top of his game, working around the clock for USUBC and its members, advocating and supporting Ukraine literally until his last breath. Many of you know how much Morgan contributed to the development of the business relationship between the United States and Ukraine. In honoring Morgan's legacy, the US-Ukraine Business Council will continue to promote the values and mission he championed to build a strong, democratic, and independent Ukraine, and to do everything possible to achieve Ukraine's victory. Morgan Williams is dearly missed by family and by all of us who knew and loved him. In coordination with Morgan's family, USUBC will share with its members any information received about memorial services or other tributes in honoring Morgan. Our sincere condolences to his family, friends, and the mourning community. I would like to use this moment and ask everyone in the audience to reflect, to think, remember Morgan, his extraordinary life and extraordinary achievements. And may I please ask Tim to say a few words. I know you knew, loved, and respected Morgan, so I hope you can remember him as well here today.
Well, you're right. I mean, I was communicating with Morgan in recent weeks and until Friday, certainly. And, you know, it's just shocking to hear the news and very, very sad. But I mean, what I can say about Morgan, I mean, he was incredibly convicted and committed to the Ukraine's cause for victory. Incredibly well-connected person. I mean, you couldn't have wanted anyone better as a clarion for Ukraine's interests in the US and actually globally than Morgan. He's going to be hugely missed. But I think we'll all look back with fond memories of him, and all my interactions over the years were always, you know, incredibly interesting, but also, you know, very human. You know, a normal human person, and you know, as has already been said, we send our best wishes to his family and those who knew him.
Thank you for this kind words, Tim. You know, they say they don't make them like this anymore. That's a unique personality that will stay in our hearts forever. So coming back to the webinar, these are the huge to feel. The audience is used to see Morgan in this space where I'm now today, but let's do our best. So let me please first outline the format of our discussion today. First, Timothy will open with about 20 minutes of his opening remarks. Then we will follow up with a round of questions by the moderator, and then we will open a Q&A session. To this end, I'm asking the audience to please submit your questions in writing. And Nadia, thank you very much, Nadia, for being here with us and for managing this webinar. Nadia will read those questions, and Tim will handle those questions. So, Tim, the floor is yours. 20 minutes opening remark. Thank you.
Sure. Just to say that, you know, we obviously, with Morgan's passing, we did think about not doing this, and we all knew that Morgan would absolutely want us to carry on because his interest was in Ukraine's victory, right? And that's going to be a focus of what I will say today. So, you know, how do I look at Ukraine from a financing perspective, and what will it take to ensure Ukraine's victory, both in the war and the post-war reconstruction? Well, first things first, I mean, you know, Ukraine's resilience so far in over 2 years, almost 2.5 years of war is absolutely remarkable. You know, the macro stability, I mean, many people would have assumed with a full-scale invasion and 2 years of war, the Ukrainian macro would have collapsed. You know, if you think of the wars for Yugoslav succession, the mid-90s, many of those economies, you think of Bosnia, you think of Serbia, Croatia, they suffered huge macro disruption because of those wars, defaults, devaluation, hyperinflation. That hasn't happened in Ukraine's case, and it hasn't happened, you know, growth, obviously, there was a big real GDP loss in the first year or so. Inflation did increase, there was a currency adjustment, but actually now, the last year or so, the economy's been growing, inflation has dropped to single digits, reserve levels are back at near record levels, banks function, money's worked. And I think that's a reflection of two things. Firstly, it's a reflection of the Western financial support that has been forthcoming, something like $40 billion a year of budget and balance of payment support, filling those gaps in the macro. And the second part is, I think we have to recognize the successive reforms post-Euromaidan. So 2015 banking cleanup, reforms at the central bank. Ukraine has a very well-qualified cadre of technocrats at the central bank, Ministry of Finance, in the banking sector that have ensured that things work and function. And, you know, let's not forget that that's been a big part of Ukraine's ability to sustain the war, that they haven't had to contend with macro instability. You imagine if, you know, what it would have been like in Ukraine if the banking sector had collapsed, there had been hyperinflation. It would have been another headache, I guess, for the country's leaders to deal with, and they haven't. And it's provided a bit of durability. You know, money's worked, banks have worked. That's helped certainly the war effort. Going forward, the concerns are around Western financing, frankly. I mean, I've written quite a lot, done a lot of work, looked at the numbers. And I think it's important not just to look at the budget financing. There's a temptation, if you look at the IMF reports, to look at the budget and balance of payment support needs. Now, they are, as I mentioned, something like around $40 billion a year. But actually, the total financing support for Ukraine, if you include budget balance of payments, you include military, also, it's about $100 billion a year. That's for the 2-year period. I use the data from the Kiel Institute and also the Ministry of Finance website. Actually, for the data to the end of April, Western financing support was about 215 billion euros. It's been running around just over $8.5 billion a month. That's been to keep Ukraine in the war. And that's, I guess you could argue, that's what's just enough to hold the line against Russia, not necessarily to win. Notable, I think, that when we saw the delays in the US, actually of that, it's basically something like 60-40. Well, actually, it's about 60-40 Europe or the rest of the world, the US, in terms of the numbers. But what is noticeable is when the US 61 billion got stuck in the US Congress, that 8.5 billion a month dropped to something like 3.7 billion between October 2023 and February 24. And notable during that period that Ukraine was being pushed back. So what we know what's needed to keep Ukraine in the war, 8.5 billion a month. And we know what doesn't work. What doesn't work is when US funding isn't there. And then the financing dropped to 3.7. Ukraine was pushed on the back foot. I would argue to push to ensure that Ukraine has forward momentum, you need something significantly more than $100 billion a year. More likely 150 if you look at Russian military spending, and that equates to something like 12.5 billion. My concern here obviously relates. Well, Ukraine is not getting enough. It's not getting the full 150 billion. It's only getting something like 100 billion. What happens if Trump wins? If US financing drops off a cliff, as it could well do after the November elections in the US, and then we get back to something like we were getting in that period between October and February, which is not enough. I don't really see the financing assurances from Europe has been sufficient to make up for a likely fall off of, say, 40 billion a year of US money. If you think of the 50 billion shortfall going from 100 to 150, that's a $90 billion a year fall in financing for Ukraine, which I just don't think can be made up from Europe, given the populism that we're seeing in Europe at the moment. Obviously, European elections show some of the challenges for European politicians. I don't think there is necessarily appetite from taxpayers in certainly Europe to cover that large financing shortfall. So the question is where the monies should be made up, where it will be made up from. I don't see any other alternative but to using immobilized Russian assets. Obviously, there's a lot of focus on that. It's been a bit of a moving target. Initially, the message from G7, our G7 leadership was we can't touch it. There are all these different reasons why we can't touch it. Obviously, concerns about reserve currency status of the euro and the dollar, concerns about retaliation on Western assets in Russian jurisdiction, concerns about the legal issues around it, all those kind of things. But actually, what we have seen some progress. So then we saw the Europeans making a bit of progress in terms of using the interest or taxing the interest on immobilized Russian assets. Now we hear that there is some more progress now on innovative means around multiplying up the interest, leveraging that interest, and we have this idea around a 50 billion loan program for Ukraine, securitizing, leveraging up the interest earned on those immobilized Russian assets. And hopefully we're going to see some progress there at the forthcoming G7 summit. It's better than nothing, the 50 billion. But when you think of it in terms of this idea of $150 billion need to finance a Ukrainian victory, it only provides 5 months of funding for Ukraine, actually the 50 billion. And it's not enough also to fill the gap if US funding falls off a cliff is possible if Trump wins the election. I notice, and I think it's quite interesting that talking to US policymakers, there was a real reluctance for much of last year to go after the underlying assets in terms of the immobilized assets, until I think the Biden administration realized the difficulties in getting the 61 billion financing package over the line. And then suddenly the focus moved to how can we do something quickly to mobilize more around or leverage up the interest on immobilized Russian assets. And then we began to get some progress. There's been I think a realization also perhaps in Europe about the difficulties in meeting the financing gap and what is needed to ensure Ukrainian victory. And it now seems like some kind of agreement, a political agreement, to get this 50 billion. But again, I don't think it's enough. I don't think it's enough to fill the gap if Trump wins. I don't think it's enough to step up support for Ukraine from this 100 billion to 150 to put Ukraine on the front foot. In the end, I see no alternative but using the full 330 billion of immobilized Russian assets in Western jurisdictions. You know, I've written a lot about it. I've spoken a lot about it. I think the arguments against are extremely weak. I noticed today an FT report quoting officials at the ECB arguing that changes in holdings of euros as a reserve currency have dropped by about 100 billion, and there's some kind of link to concerns about frozen Russian assets. If you read the underlying ECB report, there is no evidence of that. There is no evidence at all, in my mind, that the move to immobilization in February 2022 has seen any change in reserve holdings by other central banks, frankly. The actual ECB report suggests there was about 100 billion declining holdings of the euro, but actually it went into other G7 currencies, into the dollar. So I think the arguments against are, there's no evidence to suggest it would happen. As I've written, there are simply no liquid alternatives to the euro and the dollar as reserve currencies. If other authoritarian regimes, let's say the Chinese, decided a move from immobilization to freezing Russian assets, if they decided to pull assets from G7 jurisdictions, the likely global impact of that will be catastrophic in terms of global markets. The Chinese do not want that. They will not do that because they ultimately will be the losers from that, because the result will be a flight to quality, a flight to safe haven. So actually euro and the dollar will rally in response to that. It will not suit Chinese interests at all. China is interested in stable global markets, a return to the globalization rule order, and doing something so aggressive to Europe and the US potentially, I don't think would serve their wider geopolitical interests. So I think that is scaremongering by the ECB. I think there's a fundamental unwillingness by bureaucrats in Europe to do what is needed in terms of immobilized Russian assets. But in reality, I don't think they get the underlying numbers around Ukraine. As I mentioned before, this idea that 100 billion sustains Ukraine in the war, 150 billion needs to win, the problems around a Trump victory, etc. And they provide no alternative financing scenarios. You know, okay, if we're not going to use immobilized Russian assets to fill this financing shortfall, what else are we going to do? How are we going to meet the shortfall? And what are the consequences if we don't adequately finance Ukraine? I would argue the consequences of a Ukrainian defeat, a Russian victory, are catastrophic for the euro and for Europe and the European project. It will mean tens of millions of Ukrainians moving west. It will mean Russian tanks on more of NATO's borders. It will mean a massive increase in defense spending in Europe. Not the 2% of GDP target as at the moment, more likely 3% of GDP. That's hundreds of billions of euros more in defense spending. And I think a massive confidence hits the euro. So I would challenge European leaders and leaders of the ECB, including Lagarde, to explain exactly how it is. What are really the risks of using immobilized Russian assets, and the counterfactual, what happens if we don't do it? What are the consequences for Europe for not doing that? So, so in summary, remarkable the resilience we've seen in Ukraine so far in terms of the macro. It's because of the support that the West has given to Ukraine and the stellar work done by Ukrainian officials since 2015, actually, in the reform story. We need to step up our financial assistance to Ukraine, not only to sustain it in the war, but to bring this war to an end as soon as possible. I would argue that it needs at least 150 billion. There's obviously a lot of focus at the moment on recovery and reconstruction. Obviously, there's a Berlin Ukraine Recovery Conference. While I think it's understandable why we focus on recovery and reconstruction, there was obviously the second Gulf War, the dreadful US experience in Iraq, and all the focus on victory and no focus on what happens after the victory. I think in this case, in the Ukraine's case, there's perhaps been too much focus on recovery and reconstruction and not enough focus on actually how do we win the war. There will be no recovery and reconstruction if Ukraine doesn't win the war. Likewise, Russia will not pay reparations unless Ukraine wins. There will be no discussion about recovery, reconstruction, and reparations, and etc., unless we ensure Ukrainian victory. So I think there needs to be a change of emphasis, and there needs to be an acceptance that the funding envelope as is not enough, and we need to rebalance the focus from recovery and reconstruction actually to focusing on winning the war and financing Ukraine's victory. I can talk about recovery and reconstruction a little bit more, but maybe I'll wait until the Q&A session. Irina, should we actually end there? And there's probably quite a lot there to focus on and talk around.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I do have a few follow-up questions. First, on the Russian sovereign assets that are held in the West, it's about 350 billion total. For a long time, Europeans who hold most of those assets were looking at the United States for leadership. And finally, the United States delivered. Just a few weeks ago, the United States adopted a Repo Act, which allows directly the administration to confiscate the Russian sovereign assets that are held in the United States. We are not talking about big numbers, maybe it's $5–6 billion, but this is a law, a US law that allows the administration to confiscate these assets and calls for creation of Ukraine Support Fund, and then says that if there will be an international Ukraine Support Fund, then it's allowed to move these assets into the International Support Fund. So the United States delivered. Now we look back at the Europeans, and the only country which so far in the European Union adopted a law allowing confiscation of those assets is Estonia. This is all very new and very fresh. The Repo Act is only a few weeks old. There are deadlines, certain deadlines, and it's an option which is offered to the administration. It's not an obligation of the administration to confiscate. But I think it was a great impetus for the EU also to start thinking about real actions instead of just, discussing some half measures or weak measures. So in this context, what do you think the Europeans, how they will react now, knowing that the US has this law, and will it really impact the decisions of the G7 that we are expecting in the upcoming few days? And I know you are a vocal critic of ECB and Christine Lagarde as president, but when you have all the arguments, but how can they be convinced to reconsider their position and to understand the danger their inaction carries for the entire European continent, for the peace and stability and economic health of the European continent, and who and how can convince them? That's the question.
Yeah, sure. So, there are lots of layers to the difficulties around doing this, right? Obviously, one is the legal issue. The Repo Act essentially created the legal ability of the Biden administration to act as far as immobilized Russian assets in the US jurisdiction, right? So, through executive order, Biden can confiscate those assets. As you mentioned, unfortunately, an insufficient, the numbers in the US are paling to insignificance compared to the amount of assets in European jurisdictions, particularly obviously in Euroclear in Belgium. I think mentioned around 170 billion in Belgium in particular. The US can act with the UK and Canada and Japan. The numbers are not small. Those countries acting could generate around 100 billion, I think, in total of immobilized Russian assets for Ukraine's use. There is obviously a concern from the Reserve Currency Act angle that if the US acts on its own, you could see a movement of reserves from the dollar to the euro, right? So clearly there's a reluctance from the US to do it unilaterally. And as we've seen, I think, with the ECB report today, I mean, you know, and we've seen with sanctions actions by the West against Russia, there's been a desire to act in unison together to show solidarity. And I think that their desire is certainly there. That the US doesn't want to act on its own. It wants to act with its allies. It wants to close off alternative routes for sanctions evasion as well, or in this respect. So, so there's a desire to bring Europe along with the US, UK, and Canada that have obviously been leading the way in terms of immobilized Russian assets. On the European angle, in explaining the reluctance, well, I should also argue that the legal basis for confiscation, I think, has been clearly made now by Bob Zolik, Philip Zelikow, and Shishkina, right? I mean, the counterterrorism argument for me looks pretty clear. I would also argue, from a legal perspective, in the end, laws are set by politicians, right? Need and needs must. And I think if the political willingness is there to do this, if the security and financial necessity is clear, it will be done. Politicians will do whatever it takes. I think there is simply foot dragging. Well, there's lobbying certainly by certain interests in Europe against it. I think there's a failure in Europe to really understand the security risks, the national security imperative of supporting Ukraine and ensuring Russia doesn't win. I think there are still pro-Russian elements in Europe that, frankly, are working in Russia's interests and not Europe's interests. And I think we need to expose all those. In terms of one of the angles that's been used, and I haven't mentioned it already, there's certainly lobbying by Western business interests that have assets in Russia, right? There's a concern that if the West moves from immobilization to confiscation and allocation of these assets to Ukraine, there'll be some retaliation from the Kremlin against those Western assets in the Russian jurisdiction. Something around $70 billion of assets remain stranded, or less stranded, I should say. Many of those assets are still performing, and Western businesses are still reaping large windfall profits from those assets. I would say that, firstly, in terms of this idea of retaliation, it is already happening in many instances. The Kremlin is already forcing peppercorn price sales of these assets to Kremlin elites. Where that's not happening, I would also argue that in the end, Western business that invested in Russia over the last 10 years did so out of their own interests, right? I mean, they made bad calls. They misread Russia. They misread the geopolitical setting. And that's why they're now exposed in terms of their assets left in Russia. I don't think that Western national security interests should play second fiddle to the interests of Western business that made those bad investment decisions, actually. And another way to think about it, and on the issue of funding Ukraine's victory and successful reconstruction, and I'm amazed that politicians don't really focus on this. It's this idea of who pays ultimately. And actually, cutting to the chase here, you know, Russian central bank assets in Western jurisdictions are actually Russian taxpayer assets in Western jurisdictions, right? Ultimately, the Russian taxpayer owns this cash, and it is cash sitting in Western bank accounts. And actually, what our governments are saying, in effect, the European governments that are opposing move from immobilization to confiscation, is they would rather spend Western taxpayer money funding the war in Ukraine and then subsequently funding recovery and reconstruction than going after Russian taxpayer assets in our jurisdiction. They're making Western taxpayers subordinate to Russian taxpayers. Now, I would think that should be a political scandal in all Western jurisdictions. If the German government or Belgian government or Italian government are not willing to go after Russian assets, but would rather charge their own taxpayers for helping Ukraine defend itself and then ultimately in recovery and reconstruction, I can't see how that is is possibly sustainable, right? It should be a political scandal. It's as simple as that. Western taxpayers, if they have to pay, should be behind Russian taxpayers in paying to fund this war and the subsequent recovery and reconstruction. That's the harsh reality.
Yeah, this is really absurd, especially that there is an absolutely clear, solid basis in international law that provides for countermeasures just for this particular situation. And the politicians somehow are hesitating or, not really trying to do something decisive here. And you mentioned the lobbyists, Russian lobbyists in the West, in Europe. And in this context, I think we should also talk about renegades inside the EU, for example, like Hungary and also NATO. And I think what United States is worried about, and this was reported actually today, that in terms of 50 billion loan to Ukraine option, secured by the revenues from the Russian sovereign assets, the United States is worried that after this loan is made, then the EU extends the sanctions every 6 months, and that every time the Russian lobbyists inside the EU will block the extension of sanctions, and then, this security of the $50 billion loan will be in jeopardy. To this end, it's not only with regards to EU, but NATO as well. They have consensus principle on decisions. Do you believe that the consensus principle in the EU and NATO is outdated now? And when a small member, who is actually a recipient and not a contributor, blackmails the whole organization and the absolute majority of the organization, how do you think this should be addressed? Because otherwise the blackmail will continue every time, and the US is very worried about that.
Well, you mentioned Hungary, and today there was, I think, Jens Stoltenberg met with the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, and Orban seems to have been persuaded to step aside in terms of his concerns about NATO support for Ukraine, although, the agreement was, I think, that Hungary itself would not necessarily have to contribute to that support. I mean, I think with Orban, although we're unclear about his ultimate motivations, I think it's pretty clear that one of them is leverage to secure release of stalled stalled EU structural fund flows to Hungary. So he's playing a bit of a game himself for financing there. Just a couple of things to go back on. I mean, on the 50 billion financing facility that's been agreed, I worry that in a way, EU, the vested interests within the EU that are ultimately trying to stall the use of immobilized Russian assets for Ukraine are just using this as a sop to stall the whole process, right? And actually the legal complications, as you mentioned, around using the 50 billion, it just seems much easier to go after the underlying assets. When will Ukraine actually get the 50 billion? It needs the money now, right? I mean, actually, if Ukraine, if it needs the funding now to ensure the victory. Again, this idea that we shouldn't necessarily be focused on recovery and reconstruction at some point in the future. The quicker, the sooner we provide Ukraine with the financing, the sooner it will win, and the sooner we can get on with the issues of recovery and reconstruction. And then I wouldn't necessarily focus on countries like Hungary that are stalling in terms of the immobilized Russian assets. It is actually countries like Italy and Belgium. I mean, Belgium in particular, because of Euroclear. Belgium and Euroclear seem to be concerned about, particularly concerned, I guess, about other authoritarian regimes potentially pulling their assets out of the Belgian jurisdiction and its impact in terms of Euroclear's business model and the systemic risks, I guess, to Euroclear and the European economy. I would argue if Euroclear is systemically important, and if supporting Ukraine in its victories is also systemically important to Europe, that actually potential losses to Euroclear from potential future Russian legal action then Euroclear itself shall be indemnified by Europe. I would also question, in terms of Belgium's commitment itself to support Ukraine, why the interest earned on those immobilized Russian assets is being retained for the years 22 and 23 up to February 24. It's about 5 billion euros of interest is staying in Belgium. Even if there is agreement from the European Union to use taxes on the interest earned after February 2024, what about the money earned before then? That again should be a scandal of huge proportions. I mean, I would say that Belgium, it smacks of Belgium profiteering from the war. There is no justification for Belgium to sit on the 5 billion euros of interest. Ukraine should be getting that money now.
Right, thank you. So we will be waiting for the G7 decision, which is, as I said, expected any day, as of tomorrow, Thursday. And we will see how it will progress, this issue. Now coming to the rebuilding, there is a Berlin conference on recovery of Ukraine happening right now as we speak. I'm actually in Berlin, attending many side events of this conference. And I know that you are a skeptic of those conferences. They happen once a year. The first one was held in Lugano, then the next one in London, now in Berlin. But don't you think that the conference has matured and now there are much more practical results coming out of such conferences? There is a much higher level of representation. President Zelensky is here. He was at the conference yesterday. How do you think these conferences can be actually used to really help with rebuilding of Ukraine, especially now that Russia destroys systematically the energy infrastructure, the power plants? So how this conference can translate into practical results in saving, the today's needs of Ukraine's economy?
Well, look, I mean, they are good platforms to further, highlight Ukraine's difficulties and its financing needs, and hopefully to focus the attention of the international donor investor community around, Ukraine's pressing needs at the moment. In a way, I just think the balance is now not correct. A year ago we were in London. There was still the counteroffensive was still in operation. There were still hopes of an early end to the war. A year later, that's not necessarily the case, right? I much prefer the focus to be on winning the war, financing victory, and there's been a lot of investment in recovery and reconstruction, and when the war ends, we hopefully we can get on with it, right? I mean, the concerns I have, and they're long-standing, around the institutional structure around recovery and reconstruction. I don't really see any progress there. I long argued, 2 years ago almost, argued that if we assume, let's assume there is better focus on financing victory. If we do focus on recovery and reconstruction, I do think there is a need for a recovery and reconstruction institution. I've argued there's need for some kind of sovereign wealth fund structure, an entity that can help and manage and coordinate recovery and reconstruction. It would be an entity co-owned or managed by Ukraine and Western countries. It would be an entity that would be able to borrow on its own behalf. It would be a partner for investors. It would be an equity investor in Ukraine's recovery and reconstruction. And actually, it would be, again, a clarion and champion for recovery and reconstruction in Ukraine, and also for investors in Ukraine. It will help to focus and drive the reform efforts in the country. And I drew the comparison with the creation of EBRD in the early 1990s. Some have argued that Ukraine doesn't need such an entity. That role can be assumed by the development banks like EBRD. I would counter that by saying that, I think Ukraine's successful recovery and reconstruction is the most important European project, strategic project in the last 30 years. And if it's that important, as was transition from plan to market in the early 90s, which saw the creation of EBRD, then an institution should be created to manage this process. And the creation of such an institution would, I think, send a message of how important it is, and that the West buys into this project as a long-term goal. Problems I have with EBRD managing the transition are its shareholder base is too diverse. It includes Russia. Its terms of reference are also too broad now. The broader region, North Africa. I think Ukraine, this project needs an entity that is solely devoted to ensuring Ukraine's successful recovery and reconstruction. And I don't think we are seeing a strong enough leadership and coordination actually between Western donors around Ukraine's recovery and reconstruction.
I know that you advocated such an agency for a long time, and of course there have been all kinds of plans, but again, only half measures after 2.5 years of the war almost, and a lot of efforts on creating this agency. We still don't have it. You even proposed a name for the agency. I think it's
Agency for Ukrainian Reconstruction and Accession to the EU. I mean, look, in the end, I mean, some argue that the EU will take up this role given the accession story. I think that's ultimately somewhat correct, but I think, you know, this project of Ukrainian reconstruction is so important that it needs, you know, a big hitter leader, lead entity, strong leadership. I think, you know, private investors in particular. It's interesting you mentioned previous recovery and reconstruction conferences. London, there was a big focus on the private sector. If you remember last year, the assumption was the private sector would lead this Ukrainian reconstruction recovery. One of the problems, I guess, historically, you know, private investors, and we've certainly been one of them investing in Ukraine over the years, is the track record, certainly in terms of corruption, rule of law, those kind of things, has been pretty dreadful. And, you know, private investors, I think, need a partner in this process of investing in Ukraine. And I think such an agency could be that partner, actually. They could be co-investors in recovery and reconstruction in Ukraine, and they could help mitigate some of the concerns by the private investment community around its role in that process.
Agree. You have been a very close observer and analyst of reforms in Ukraine. And of course, with the focus on EU accession, the reform process is now becoming more institutionalized. There is conditionalities back on the table. At the beginning of the war, understandably, nobody was talking about conditionality because we were actually surviving in the survival mode. Now, the EU accession is actually a clear prospect. It was reported that by the end of June, the European Commission will approve the negotiating framework, and there will be held the first intergovernmental conference on Ukraine accession to the EU. Both EU side and Ukrainian side are reporting the progress. All the criteria have been met, as far as I understand, at this stage by Ukraine. But then there will be a massive revamping of Ukrainian legislation, Ukrainian institutions at every step of the way. So what's your view right now on the progress of Ukraine's reforms? What do you want? What are your expectations, including for the private sector to be able to come and help rebuild Ukraine, as you just mentioned? Of course, you know, Ukraine is in the middle of the brutal, horrible war, defending itself. But the prospect of EU membership is such a motivation that we are hoping that the reforms will be carried out in parallel with defending the country. So what are your views on the current state of reforms and the prospects of reforms?
Look, I mean, there's been such big financial flows to Ukraine during the last 2.5 years. As I mentioned, 100 billion a year. It's actually been 215 billion euros in the period to April 24, according to the Kiel Institute data, and actually some data from the Ministry of Finance. There's been a lot of talk about holding Ukraine to account for reforms, right? Look, in reality, it's very hard for a country to reform during a war, an existential war for its survival, right? I mean, so I think it's a little bit difficult to, and obviously recently there's been a lot of focus on, the cabinet changes in the Zelensky administration and criticism of change of the recovery and reconstruction team from the Ukrainian side, etc., in terms of personalities, right? Bottom line is we need to ensure Ukraine's victory, right? Once Ukraine wins, let's talk about recovery and reconstruction, and let's talk about, the reform agenda and all that kind of thing. I am very bullish Ukraine on victory, right? I'm bullish because of the resilience resilience and innovation Ukraine has seen during the war. It's just remarkable. Look at the drone technology that's been advanced, right? Ukraine has kind of proven itself through this war. Secondly, I think you mentioned EU accession. I mean, I think one reason Ukraine hasn't developed for the last 30 years is it had no EU accession anchor, right? All those countries like Poland, Baltic states, Czech Republic, Hungary, they reformed at a remarkable pace in that transition period, but they reformed because, one, there was a clear commitment from the European Union to accept these countries. If you look at the Treaty of Copenhagen in '94, and there was a clear blueprint of reform, right? So as a message to these countries, if you tick the boxes, you deliver on the blueprint we've given you, you'll join. So because they knew what they had to do and what would happen, the prize that if they delivered on reform, they did it. Ukraine never had that, right? There was no clear anchor in terms of EU accession. Ukraine drifted in this no man's land between East and West. I think now we have a clear commitment from Europe, a clear realization that Ukraine is only going to move forward if it's given this clear EU accession perspective. So I think that will massively clarify the reform agenda. There's going to be no discussion about, whether this law or that law should be. I mean, as long as it has to be compliant with EU acquis, and then it just has to be delivered as quickly as possible, right? So I think with that clear EU accession perspective, and assuming financing is assured, including using immobilized Russian assets, I think Ukraine's recovery and reconstruction post victory will be, pretty strong. And I think the private sector at that point will be very willing to invest in the country. I mean, the reconstruction, the strength of the military and defense industries, the strength of innovation. We know Ukraine's strengths in terms of agriculture and IT actually also. Lots of opportunities in the energy sector. I'm very bullish, but, bottom line is we need to ensure Ukraine's victory. And we are not doing that at present. The numbers do not add up, right? They do not add up unless we use immobilized Russian assets. That's the harsh reality. So we can look at reform, but in the end, it's about the numbers. It's about finance. And we have to make sure we are giving Ukraine the $8.5 billion a month it needs to sustain the war or defend itself. But we need to do more than that. We need to increase that as much as possible. And I would argue to at least 12.5 billion a month to ensure it is able to go on the front foot.
I absolutely agree here. But again, despite the war, the EU prospect, which became very real now, we are on the right track. And this is a huge motivation because Ukraine's future is firmly in the European Union, is firmly with the civilized world, and we need to move no matter what. And of course, the reforms that are required by EU, they are different at each stage. Right now, Ukraine fulfilled all the requirements to start the negotiations, and then at every next stage, there will be a new requirement. So let's hope that Ukraine will be able to comply with those requirements and can be on a fast track to join the European Union. Right now, I would like to open the floor for questions. We have quite a few of them, and Nadia, thank you again for managing this, and please go through the questions.
Thank you very much, Irina and team. Condolences to everybody who share our sorrow and sadness. Let's go to the Q&A. We have several questions from Ivan Verstyuk, who is a journalist, Ukrainian journalist. Number one is Ukrainian government wants to spend 8 billion to support the privately owned businesses, $1 billion of budgetary funds plus 7 billion euros from the EU-Ukraine facility. Do you think it's okay to give public funds into private hands, and how this should be properly done, if done at all?
Well, it's hard to be specific about a particular set of projects, but you know, look, you know, in a wartime scenario where there are, you know, significant security risks that would normally hold back private business and particularly international business, I think that there are justifications for using public money to help mitigate those risks for key investments, right? And so you know, I think you can't, you know, you can't. I mean, I know in Western developed market economies, there's a reluctance, you know, the state aid provisions and all those kind of things. But I think Ukraine is a pretty exceptional case where a war is being engaged, and you know, I think you can make a special case for that.
Another brief question from Ivan. Timothy, do you think there will be a line of people willing to buy debt of Ukrainian energy companies after the electricity tariffs were raised drastically by the Ukrainian government?
Again, hard to be specific on those particular cases. You know, as we know, I mean, in the end, look, you know, energy prices have to be increased to market levels, and the ability of a state engaged in war to continue to subsidize the energy sector is somewhat limited, right? So, you know, market price. I mean, ultimately, in terms of investment in the energy sector, the war needs to end, and you know, if the war ends, I think there'll be significant interest from certainly international capital markets and international investors to invest in the energy sector, given its assurance on the security situation.
Jeffrey Diaz is asking, what is the outlook now for overcoming corruption during the recovery and reconstruction period, now that Mustafa Najem and Alexander Kubrakov are gone from the state agency for restoring Ukraine? Unfortunately, funds for winning the war will be more limited if the specter of corruption is not convincingly addressed.
Well, you know, I think the international community and certainly the private sector would accept that, you know, corruption will continue to be a constraint on the development of Ukraine, and needs to be a continued focus for the government and certainly the official sector. Positives in my mind are now the strength of the civil society in Ukraine, and assuming victory, I think the population at large will hold government and actually the private sector to account around corruption. The EU accession process itself, I think, will help anchor the anti-corruption drive and agenda, perhaps much more so than proved to be the case in the years previous. So, you know, again, I don't want to be very specific about the personnel changes more recently, but you know, I think once the war ends and given the accession anchor, I think we will begin to see finally real progress in terms of the anti-corruption delivery in terms of anti-corruption.
Thank you. Robert Holmans, a longtime friend of USUBC and international financial analyst, is asking, I understand that Ukrainian tax revenues make up approximately 50% of Ukraine's budget. Is that true? If it's true, it is a remarkable statistic, given Ukraine is at war, that needs to be better publicized to refute the argument by the members of Congress and others that US non-military support for Ukraine is paying public salaries, pensions, etc.?
No, you're right. I mean, again, this goes back to this idea of the resilience of the Ukrainian economy, the fact that the economy is growing despite war, that people are paying taxes. Tax collection is proving remarkably robust. But there clearly the war is costing Ukraine a huge amount of money, right? There's a limit to what the tax base can deliver upon, and obviously there needs to be significant international support beyond what Ukrainians can pay in terms of tax.
Anton Zadarygolova is asking if it's possible to add Russia to the blacklist of FATF.
Well, some of us, including myself, have been long arguing for FATF blacklisting, and also highlighting Russia as a state sponsor of terror. There are many other things that we can think of and do to increase pressure on Russia. Notable, I think, the US government have introduced a wave of additional secondary sanctions, which hopefully will help increase pressure on Russia. I've argued, actually, there's an interesting, on the sanctions front, Nigel Guldelvis at IIS has argued for this idea of a zero tolerance policy in terms of trade with Russia. Setting a target perhaps longer in advance, let's say 4 or 5 years from now, signaling to Western business that they shouldn't be doing business with Russia, and arguing that setting a default setting where in 5 years' time you shouldn't do any business with Russia unless you get special licenses or dispensation. I think that would send an incredibly strong signal to Western international business that they should be thinking about exiting Russia and reducing trade with Russia now. So lots of things we could do in addition, I think.
Bota Ilias, pardon if I mispronounced the name, is asking, what would you say to those who argue that funding Ukraine's victory over Russia would lead to unpredictable consequences from the Kremlin, such as a direct Russia-NATO war? I believe this is to be one of the underlying drivers of reluctance in the West to fund Ukraine more aggressively.
Yeah, I mean, fair point, right? I think in general, there's been an overabundance of caution with respect to how we treat Russia and how we treat President Putin. If you go through the spectrum of Western escalation or perceived Western escalation, if you look at, Russia set lots of red lines: T-72s, MiG-29s, HIMARS, Leopards, F-16s, etc. And I think what we learned during this process is that Putin is scared of NATO ultimately, right? Putin doesn't want to get involved in a direct war with NATO because the performance of Russian military technology in the last 2.5 years relative to Western military technology have been dismal. Russia would get defeated in a conventional war with NATO very, very quickly. So our lesson that we should learn from this is that Putin is a bully. He only respects power and strength. We show weakness, he takes advantage of that, right? So we should do what we need to do to ensure Ukraine's victory, because that's in our own best interest, right? And we should also think of what happens if Ukraine loses. And I think not enough European politicians have been contemplating that. And again, as I argued earlier, the consequences of Ukrainian defeat are dismal for Europe. It would be a disaster for the euro, a disaster for the European economy. So we need to do everything we can to ensure that that doesn't happen.
There are two similar questions, one from Natalia Shulga and one from Denis Ilnitsky. Do you think it will be reasonable to invest into preparation of the blueprints in the reform of education, research, and technology fields to be ready after victory to move forward quickly? And the other one is, what is the role of innovations in rebuilding Ukraine in a better competitive way as as well as to win the war? What could be the needed volume of investments into innovations, and what are key sectors?
It's a bit beyond my competence in terms of, it's not my area of specialism. I mean, what I would say is, look, again, going back, Ukraine has proved itself in terms of its defense, in terms of the use of innovation. We know Ukraine's strength: food, agriculture, innovation, defense industries now, aerospace. I mean, these are clearly going to be, once the war ends, these are going to be sectors that Western business will love to invest in, and I think Ukraine will excel in. I think I'll end it there.
Can I add something on innovation, Tim? I know you are a big champion of innovation. You recently attended a conference on innovation. Here in Berlin, innovation is a big focus. I was yesterday at an event organized by UNation, and this was totally devoted to innovation technologies. And I can tell you that on the panels, nobody was below 25 probably. And they were presenting incredible projects, incredible technology. I didn't understand probably 70% of what they were saying, but it looked like the audience knew exactly, what they were presenting. And I think some deals have been made yesterday. So there is a big focus on innovation, and that's something that conventionally people don't discuss at events like ours. But we probably should do an event like this with USUBC and talk about innovations, which are somehow also driven by the military needs, but that translate into bigger economy of Ukraine. So if you agree now that you will join this event and we'll talk about innovation.
No, absolutely. I mean, you mentioned, there was a conference in the UK a couple of weeks ago on drones, and they had the 10 largest Ukrainian drone companies, military drone companies in London, explaining their stories, and it was they were exceptional, right? And it was inspiring hearing their stories, and the fact that they're learning, their experience they're getting in combat and warfare is actually leading from the front, right? And their knowledge base and their product already were far in advance of, I think, what we have in the UK, right? So I think those companies will be at the leading edge of Ukraine's ultimate recovery and success in the future in terms of economic development.
Thank you. So if we compare the amount of support to Ukraine toward the war per capita, is it the same when comparing the US to EU?
Well, yes. If we want to go down that route, it's clear we know the countries like the Baltic states, Poland, etc. Their contribution to Ukraine's wartime effort is far higher than, unfortunately, developed Western economies. They understand, I guess, the strategic imperative of ensuring Ukrainian victory much more so than some of those established NATO partners. It's unfortunate. Many countries could be doing more than they are already. In the end, look, I think many of the same reasons that we failed to comprehend the threat from Russia for the last decade, particularly under Putin, are the same reasons I think that there are still those vested interests in Europe that are stalling providing Ukraine with the full support, both in terms of finance and military support, right? Again, going back to this idea, I think, Russia's influence runs very deep in many countries in the Western alliance. Not only in the obvious suspects, but in some of the ones that maybe are less obvious, right?
Nadia, I'm sorry, we only have about 7 minutes left for Q&A. So depending on how many questions you still have, maybe we should go much faster through the questions and answers. because we have to finish on time. So it's 7 minute Q&A, and then we will thank team who will take another couple of minutes.
Thank you, sure. So Maria Panga from George Mason University. US and European companies keep financing the war machine by paying profit taxes to Russia budget. What is your opinion on imposing sanctions, profit taxes, or any other measures on headquarters of those companies who are still not leaving Russia?
Yes, I mean, I personally would be supportive, right? Unfortunately, many of those companies still have very strong lobbying efforts in Western countries to alleviate that kind of pressure. I mean, I think exposing and shaming these companies for what they're doing in Russia is, I think the civil society in Ukraine have been very successful there. In fact, if you look at inspiring, I mean, if you look at the things that have actually been achieved in naming and shaming companies, if you look at Russian index exclusion, I don't think many people thought that would happen, but it was through these campaigns that we're seeing. If you look at the frozen Russian asset issue, again, remarkable campaigns and very energized and motivated people running them. So I think continued focus and effort exposing Western business that are continuing to operate and profit from Putin's fascist regime, the better, I think.
Mark Luther is asking practical question. Who can I speak with directly to put private investment funds into trusted public hands in Ukraine?
Well, there are a number of, it depends on what level, but in terms of private equity, I know there are a number of funds recently been launched. Maybe you drop me a line privately and I can put you onto those rather than revealing it on the public domain. But there's lots of initiatives around that, and some of the funds launched have completed their fundraising in very short periods of time, which suggests there's very strong interest still, even in wartime conditions, to invest in Ukraine.
This one can be to both of you, Irina and Tim. How should Ukraine resolve its labor supply issue, given the brutal war and the need to fight on one hand and to keep the economy running on the other?
I mean, it's extremely difficult, right? And difficult choices have to be made, right? But I would just go back to the West. Ultimately, we have to conclude the war as soon as possible by giving Ukraine the resources to ensure its victory. The quicker the war ends, the better we finance Ukraine's victory. Then those kind of issues, we won't have to address those kind of issues, right? The longer the war goes on, those challenges will just become more difficult.
But just to add to this is the main point, of course. But to add to this, Ukraine's resilience is demonstrated in this area as well, where women are retrained, for example, to take the jobs that men left going to defend the country. Innovations, technologies help a lot. So that's a huge problem, but war creates huge problems. And I think that Ukraine is actually addressing those problems and somehow coping with them. But I totally agree with Tim. As soon as we can win this war, then, we will be able to rebuild, and we will be able to rebuild the workforce as well.
I think we should turn it over back to Tim for closing remarks. Thank you, everybody, for your questions. Stay tuned for the next webinars.
No, thanks. Thanks for putting me on the spot and asking really difficult questions that I'm probably not very qualified to answer. Look, I mean, I'm encouraged. I mean, when we think of the war in particular, I mean, it's ebbed and flowed, right, in terms of optimism and pessimism. A couple of months back, there was concern about the Kharkiv offensive from Russia, the stalled $61 billion in the US Congress. All the narrative was about Ukraine's impending defeat. I mean, I think now the $61 billion has been assured that helps Ukraine certainly to get through to November. That offensive by Russia in Kharkiv seems to have been stalled somewhat as better Western military technology becomes available. It seems clear that it's going to be very difficult for Russia to take large further swathes of Ukrainian territory. But stalemate is not victory, right? Stalemate is tough for Ukrainians, right? And in the end, for recovery and reconstruction and for the country to move forward, victory has to be assured. And I've laid the numbers for me are clear cut, right? We have 2.5 years of data. We know exactly what the war is costing. It's also clear, we have periods when Western financing have reduced, and we've seen the consequences on the battlefield. So I think if the West is serious about ensuring Russia doesn't win in Ukraine and ensuring Ukraine's victory, and that should be in our national security interests, then we have to ensure that we provide the money one way or another. I've argued that the only source of sufficient financing to assure Ukraine's victory quickly is immobilize Russian assets. Those people who oppose that have to give an alternative financing scenario. What we know is what we have at the moment is not working. I mean, the fact that the war has gone on for 2.5 years is clear evidence of that, right? If we want a speedy end to the war, we have to give Ukraine exactly what it needs to win. We're not doing that at present. We just have to step up and really comprehend the imperative of ensuring Russia doesn't win. In the end, it's a political decision. It's a political decision by Western leaders, particularly in Europe, to understand, what's at stake here, and what happens if we don't do what is required.
Thank you very much, team. This was a fascinating discussion. As when I introduced you, I said that 35 years you have been analyst and observer of Ukraine, and a big supporter of Ukraine as a part of the civilized world, and all your superb expertise is contributing to this overall goal that we are all, looking forward to, winning the war and becoming an integral part of the civilized world. So thank you ever so much for everything you do. I know you are admired by many Ukrainians and international observers of Ukraine. You can see it from the comments and from the questions. So I want to thank you again, and I hope we will see you very soon at USUBC events. And again, I want to remember Morgan. We see his picture, and I think he's with us in spirit. And I'm sure that everything that Tim said, he would wholeheartedly support and agree. Thank you very much, and see you next time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.